Hi guys. Well, for me, this is where it starts to get plain weird because the era I'm going to be thinking about now is my lifetime. Okay, if I'm thinking about the Britain of Wilson, Heath, and Callaghan, 64 to 79, if you want to be precise with the dates, that's the era in which I grew up. Start of that era, I was a little boy, not yet at school, age 4. By the end of it, I'd left school and was in my first year at university. So this is strange, talking about yourself in a sense. Also, you're in a room in which basically you're surrounded by props which are actually from the time. Vinyl LP. Yee, look at that beautiful thing. Yeah, important moment in my life buying that. The 45 RPM single. Worth a few bob, that one. A book of poetry. All from the 70s. Okay. So I kind of have a personal take on this as well, which I'll try and keep my lid on, but it won't avoid it. For many, we have a kind of two-tone story here. We go from the swinging 60s to the dystopian 70s. In, I think, what we might call the traditional narrative of post-war British history, the 70s is where it all went wrong, before we all had to be rescued by Margaret Thatcher sailing forth in 1979 to put the nation back on its feet again. That is one view, and there's a lot to be said for that view, by the way, that it does all go wrong in the 70s. But I'm going to offer a possible different view of this era, and that's really the 60s and 70s are actually just part of a much longer narrative, which I might call the Age of Opportunity, which I might say is really the history of post-war Britain, when that ends up with something we'll try and debate about later on. There's one other thing I think worth bearing in mind here, and that's the simple fact that it's what I call dead relative syndrome. By the time you're my age, you've seen a lot of relatives die, and it becomes really quite hard to remember your loved ones at their peak. My dad died 18 months ago, and I have to try really hard not to remember the knackered old man that was there at the end, rather than the younger man, that I knew for most of his life and most of my life. It was a very different kind of figure. I think the same could apply to politicians. It might apply to Jim Callaghan, the Callaghan that loses in 79, perhaps less so. It certainly might apply to Heath, the Heath that loses in 74. Wilson's the interesting case, because I think there are two different Harold Wilsons in this era. There's the Harold Wilson of 64 and the Harold Wilson of 74. And I think they're two very different men, and it's quite easy to sort of read the Wilson of the 60s through the prism of the Wilson of the 70s, when I think he was a much diminished figure. And, spoiler alert, I've got a degree of admiration for Harold Wilson. I've got quite a lot of admiration for Jim Callaghan. And I've got a bit of affection for Ted Heath into the bargain as well. So what I want to do is just offer you some of the themes of this period and, see what you think really. And we'll come back to these as we look in more detail at these governments. I mean, the traditional view here is we are entering the economics of the madhouse. In the 60s, inflation begins to kick in big time. That will balloon in the 1970s for reasons we'll discuss to do with economic policy, external factors like oil. But inflation will actually peak at around 25% in 1975, and it will be accompanied by unemployment, this phenomenon we call stagflation. It was also a period of sterling crises. There was basically a sterling crisis 66, 67, and even in 68 after devaluation in 1967. In 1976, a floating pound sank like a stone. So two big sterling crises. In 1976, the government had to call in the IMF, or at least they called in the IMF. Whether they had to is another question. It's famously the era of Bolshevik unions, of strikes. Famous Siemens strike of 66. And of course, the very famous miners' strikes of 1972 and 1974. 1974 led Heath to go to the country. Who governs Britain? The traditional answer was, not you, mate. And the winter of discontent of 1979. There were attempts to solve this. The Heath Industrial Relations Act, and before that, Barbara Castle's In Place of Strife. Neither came off. This was also an era of high spending chancellors, usually conservative. Maudling, we've mentioned before. Barbour. maybe Dennis Healey, the Labour Chancellor, in his first year or so, but then of retrenchers, and the big retrenchers were all Labour. Callaghan, Jenkins and Healey were actually chancellors that actually cut spending. It was an era of income policies, government attempts to regulate the level of income. So Wilson, Heath and Dennis Healey as Chancellor all introduced incomes policies with varying degrees of success. Spoiler alert, not much, except for Healey. It's also the era of the famous Ted Heath U-turn in 1972, going from being a kind of Thatcherite before his time to changing policy in the face of mountingly rising unemployment and failing businesses. It was the oil shock of 1973 and indeed of 79, in which oil prices went through the roof. Yom Kippur War, you'll remember that, guys. It's an era of high taxes. Taxes rose through this period. And it's the era where Keynesianism dies, I think it's fair to say, in its sort of a post-war sense. Famously, Jim Callaghan in 1976 getting up and telling his own party, we are paying ourselves more than we can afford. It's also a period in which there were two Labour governments with very small or even non-existent majorities. So Wilson, when he comes in 64, has a majority of 4. When Labour come in 74, they're in a minority government and a very small majority, which they lose when Callaghan becomes Prime Minister in 76. And that made government difficult. Yeah, government is always difficult with minority governments, just ask Theresa May. And then there's an era of bitter divisions. Labour were divided in government, often to do with personalities as much as anything else, but particularly in 66, 67, again around 1969, and again around the years of 75 to 76. Labour were very divided in opposition when they lost in 1970. Labour were bitterly divided over Europe, and the Labour left hated their own government. Well, they usually do. The Tories were also bitterly divided over Enoch Powell and race in 1968, and again divided over Margaret Thatcher in 1975, Thatcher versus Heath. It was also an era in which race came to the centre of British political life. The general election of 64 had a very distressingly racist note in the Smethwick seat, for example. It was Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. I'll talk about Alf Garnett and racism. His government introduced Immigration Act, as did Labour in 68, further tightening immigration, but also then admitted the Ugandan Asians, more of which are none. And it was an era of mounting racism in society, but also the beginnings of opposition to that. And when we talk about that, I'll say something, that process, which I was a small way was part of. The permissive society is a great theme of this era, of course. The great Larkin quip, sexual intercourse began in 1963. And what that really depicts is this is the beginning of the era of what was often seen as free love. It wasn't free love, of course it wasn't. What it was, much more importantly, was the beginning of an era of sexual liberation. The idea of being married, of not being married, but living together, living in sin as it used to be called, begins to become normalised in the 70s, not in the 60s, in the 70s. It will be by the 80s. This is the swinging 60s, of course, so we're thinking of the era, famously, we're thinking of drugs. Cannabis, LSD will play a big role in a small group of people, but very influential. And of course, rock and roll. This is the great era of popular music, in my humble opinion. The 60s and 70s see some of the greatest music ever made, but it was a music that was of a new generation. I think that generational thing is quite important. My generation were very different in some ways from the ones that preceded them, and a lot of that difference was informed by music, actually, and their experience of it. It's a pretty decisive era in the role of women in British society, particularly if we extend it into the 80s. Women enter the workplace in much, much larger numbers, partly to do with the changing nature of the workplace. A lot of jobs now involve this more than brawn. A lot more office work, for example, shop work, a lot more, there's a great era of consumer booms. It's an era in which divorce is reformed. Divorce becomes easier and less stigmatised, though it's still pretty stigmatised, certainly in the 60s anyway. We get the Equal Pay Act of 1970, though, as we all know, that doesn't necessarily work. It's an era of great change in consumption and the way in which we consume that has a real effect on the women's freedom of manoeuvre, particularly things like convenience food and that kind of thing, the freezer. Most of all, the contraceptive pill. And I've told many of you before, if you look at the history of my family, my great-grandmother had 17 pregnancies, 15 living children. My grandmother had lots of pregnancies, but sadly not many of them lived. My mum had me, my sister, and then went on the pill and could then go on to have a career. It was a great source of liberation of women. This is also the era of Roy Jenkins as Home Secretary. Homosexuality is legalised or decriminalised. Abortion is legalised. The death penalty comes to an end. Theatre censorship ends. It's an era of great liberal reforms. It was also the era of progressive education, which perhaps wasn't quite as progressive as it sometimes had the credit for being. As many of us now know, it was also had a very dark side to the permissive era. This was the era of, the Jimmy Saviles of the world. We will say something about that as well. It was also the era of football hooliganism. I mean, I remember this very well. I was a huge Spurs fan, and I basically stopped going, partly because I had personal reasons not going to do with playing rugby, but also it was bloody frightening. I mean, it was scary. The fights on the terraces were like an every week event and stuff. So it was quite a violent society in many ways. And it was also the era that saw the coming of punk. I mentioned this. This is Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols, right? Much more of which. It was also the era in which Britain tried to enter Europe for the second time in 1967, entered Europe in 1973, decision made in 1971, and then had a referendum on Europe in 1975. And spoiler alert, that split the Labour Party down the middle. It was also an era of a changing world. Britain retreated, in a sense, from its global role in what was called East of Suez. No more forces would be deployed east of Suez, basically. It was the era of the Vietnam War. I will argue one of Wilson's great achievements was not entering the Vietnam War. He's under huge pressure to do so. It's an era, of course, where America is going through a very dark period in its history. Nixon, etc. And that's, I think, has an effect. And at the end of this era sees the return, big style, of a much more aggressive Cold War. The forgotten bit of the history of Britain here is Northern Ireland. It's quite interesting, actually. If you read two very good books written about modern British history, Robert Tombs's The English and Their History, there's about a page, really, on Northern Ireland, hardly mentions it. David Edgerton's The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, I've mentioned this book a lot, correctly makes a lot of Northern Ireland, because the truth is that in the 1970s, Northern Ireland represented a massive destabilising force in British national life and a fundamental threat to the British state. 1969, Northern Ireland descends into violence. British troops are sent for the first time. Then, by 1972, direct rule has to be imposed, because basically the Northern Ireland government, its own government, were rabidly biased against Catholics, and some terrible things were happening. But by then, the IRA had got going, the Provisional IRA, and we enter the abyss. In 1972, depending on how you measure it, either 467 or 496 people were killed in incidents related to terrorism. Dublin and Monaghan bombings of 1974 in the Republic of Ireland saw 33 people killed, 300 injured, and one other person killed because it was a full-term unborn child. In Birmingham, in November 1974, 21 people were killed in the Birmingham pub bombings, 182 were injured. A few weeks after, Guildford had seen 5 people killed in pub bombings. Governments had to confront terrorism. The Prevention of Terrorism Act comes from 1974. The level of terrorism was far higher than all the scares we've had in recent years. You might think, well, hang on, yeah, but it was far worse, far more dangerous. It was slightly different from that. There weren't suicide bombers, etc., but it was a fundamental threat. And it went right to the top. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher's campaign manager, 75, Erin Neve, was killed by an INLA car bomb entering the House of Commons. Lord Mountbatten was killed on his boat in County Sligo, along with 3 other people, including 2 teenage boys. In many ways, the 70s are often seen as the bad era, as I said, the 60s the good. I think you can put the two with a bit of continuity, I mean, I remember the 70s. It's an era of great social mobility, first person to go to university, etc. But it's also great consumption levels, motor cars. We got our first car in the 70s, colour tellies, shag pile carpets, central heating, 3-piece suites. One of my favourite TV series of this era, particularly as a historian, because it's so good on the social detail, is one set up here. I set up in Newcastle called Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. And really, in it, one of them, he's making it big, he's making it good, and he's getting his own home, he's getting married to Thelma. And it's the new world, it's the world of the executive house, the saloon motor car, the hairdressers, not the barbers. And it's a symbol of what happened to a lot of working class people in this era, whose lives simply got better. Most people were much better off in 1979 than they were in 1964. That's not to say everything was good. Inner cities were grotty, often violent, and often scary. Britain was quite a violent place, particularly in the 70s, I think. Schools were violent, cities were violent, criminals were violent, and so were the police. Just been rewatching Life on Mars. If you've never seen that, if you want to get a taste of it, have a look then. Racism was rife. Homophobia was rife. But for most people, the period we're going to be looking at would see an improvement in their lives for all the myth, perhaps not myth, but for all the legend of the terrible 70s.